Hello and welcome to The Agenda. I'm Stephen Cole. As we head into the festive season with product shortages seemingly everywhere, this week we're asking, how do you solve a problem like supply chains? A pandemic blip or a fundamental issue? We'll be finding out what's really behind global shortages of everything from food to fridges. Plus, Suez blockage, why we're still feeling the effects of the grounding of the Ever Given. And we'll find out if China could be the key to sorting out our supply chains. Out-of-stock signs are becoming increasingly common across Europe. Shortages ranging from computer chips to toilet paper. It seems the click-and-collect era has met its match. So, what's gone wrong? Around 90% of the world's goods are transported by sea, so when in March 2021 the container ship the Ever Given was wedged in the Suez Canal, blocking all traffic for almost a week, the impact was felt all around the world. This all came on the back of COVID lockdowns, where the rate that items were produced and transported slowed down and in some cases stopped altogether. Supply chains were not built to accommodate such drastic interruptions. Thousands of empty containers were stranded in Europe and the United States. Then when demand returned, the cost of a container shipping goods from China to Europe hit record highs, increasing from around $2,000 to more than $9,000. The post-COVID boom in demand meant people wanted more of everything, ranging from gadgets to exercise equipment, and they wanted it now. Manufacturers struggled. They had to face material shortages, factory closures, and shipping delays. And because of a shortage of semiconductor chips, car manufacturers have suffered, as have tech giants like Apple, which claims it's lost $6 billion in sales. And the hangover from Brexit meant goods between the UK and the EU had to adjust to the sudden extra border checks, and a shortage of European lorry drivers meant further delays to all kinds of supplies, including petrol. 'Tis the season to be spending and gifting, but what will be available? Amazon has said it's spending several billion dollars to manage supply chain issues and labor shortages. But will the heavy Christmas consumption exacerbate a problem which experts predict will last into 2022 and well beyond? With me now is Mickey Howard, Professor in Sustainable Supply Chain Management at Exeter University. Mickey, we should start perhaps at the very beginning with the supply chain, of course. How exactly do supply chains work?
First of all, it's interesting to note that you only ever ask the supply chain professor to speak when things are going wrong. And at the moment, it's fair to say that we're in a bit of a mess. And supply chains at the very basic level are the movement of goods and services to the end consumer. And this system operates best under stable conditions. So I guess it's fair to say that in the last few months, even the last few years, we've had a lot of disruption. The key point to remember about supply chains is they're driven by information. And if some of it's real time, some of it's a bit dodgy, some of it's been downright wrong.
So it's not driven by supply and demand, or I'm thinking perhaps more, you say disruption, there could be nothing more disruptive than a pandemic.
Well, absolutely. And what we've been seeing is not only shortage of some key materials, but a shortage of workers as well. So shortage of drivers, forklift drivers, fruit pickers, all of this adds a very uncertain mix into an already challenging situation.
And has the pandemic perhaps not caused the disruption, but perhaps highlighted problems with supply chains?
Well, one of the surprises about the pandemic, when many countries were in lockdown, we thought that orders from customers would go down. What's happened is there's been an increase in orders, which was most unexpected. People were sitting at home, nothing else to do, so they were ordering stuff online. And so this huge increase in orders has really affected the supply chain.
And what about Brexit? What part did Brexit play in the supply chain issue?
Well, that's a great question. And I would have to say that Brexit has had an effect, not only with the increase in paperwork at the new borders now, but also Brexit in terms of supply of workers. With the UK now, we are really struggling with truck drivers, fruit pickers, all of that, and we're going to have to really rethink our employment policies, possibly allow worker migration to try and sort out this short-term problem.
And are all of these problems, these supply chain problems, temporary, or can you see them lasting?
Well, I'd like to say they were temporary, but I suspect this is a wake-up call for us to start thinking a little bit more about terms such as the circular economy, moving away from globalization, thinking about a more local way of working. Of course, this has got huge ramifications for local business, but I think we've become too used to having our fresh fruit and vegetables shipped over either by air or by freight. And I think this idea of localization, rather than global supply chains, but local sources of supply, makes complete sense when we're looking at now reducing carbon, thinking about more resilient ways of working, and indeed consuming. It's the customer now. You and I and all the others, all your listeners now need to start thinking about what it is that you're buying and why you're buying it. So terms such as sustainability, circularity, I think will be much more prevalent and will mean that the long term may have it in for this idea of globalization.
And who's going to drive that then, towards sustainability?
Well, it's going to be a little bit of stick and carrot from governments. It's going to be big business realizing that consumers will only buy more sustainable goods. And of course, the universities and the NGOs pushing this idea, continuing the research to see how we can buy things better.
And how can the global supply chain become more sustainable? What's the immediate act by politicians after COP26 that can make it sort of safer, healthier, greener, more sustainable?
I think start to understand the difference between terms such as sustainability and circular economy, give true incentives for business, large and small, to start thinking about how this transition to a more circular model is more sustainable. So I think there's a lot of sea change, paradigm change, whatever you want to call it. I think the latest meetings in Glasgow has to indicate that big change is needed. No more little steps, no more incremental reductions. Now we need a big change in how we do business.
Professor Mickey Howard, many thanks to you for joining us on The Agenda.
Thank you, Stephen.
So we heard there about some of the issues affecting the global supply chain, but just how can they be solved? The European Supply Chain Forum is the leading collaboration platform designed to try and help solve supply chain challenges using technology, innovative thinking, and what it calls out-of-the-box solutions. Tom Van Woensel is Professor of Freight Transport and Logistics at Eindhoven University of Technology and a director of the forum, and he joins me now. And what kind of problems are your members facing at the moment?
Yeah, so I would like to make a difference here between, let's say, the very short-term discussions. If you look at the workshops we do now, many of the workshops are, of course, relating and circulating around the idea of what is happening with COVID-19, what are the consequences of the resource scarcity, the resource availability in terms of drivers, workers, workforce. How can you get around to that? We also talk about change management discussions, but most of the time we see that the short-term discussions are circulating around the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic and how to get around to that, especially in terms of inventory, stock availability is very low, and the phenomenon which is called this bullwhip effect, this kind of going up and down in terms of order size discussions, is of course also happening quite severely now, but also a lot of discussion about how to circumvent that is happening as well. If you look at the longer term discussion, which is also part of our ecosystem, we try to somehow work around short term, but also look into the long term, then you see that we have quite a lot of boardroom discussions with companies around circularity, sustainability. How can we actually create sustainable supply chains in the future? If we have a circular supply chain where the beginning is the end, the cradle to cradle type of discussions, how would that affect my supply chain organization, network planning, and these kind of things? And of course, a very hot theme as well is everything related to artificial intelligence. How can AI, data, machine learning, all these type of concepts improve upon supply chain decision making, supply chain team building, all these kind of ethical aspects, and so on, so on, is a bit more longer term for the coming 5 years.
So that's where the technology section comes in to try and solve future problems. A recent survey suggested that over 50% of firms in Germany alone have been hit by severe problems in their supply chains, which is pushing them to diversify, shorten delivery routes, relocate production. Is that a picture you recognise? And are they the only solutions? And do they only apply to Germany or across Europe?
I recognize this picture. I think what you see with our companies in the network, which we are talking with, they have very similar type of issues. And you see that the COVID-19 situation and the current situation in terms of extreme volatility in the supply chain in terms of availability, workforce, and so on, so on, is actually showing something that the past years there was a lot of focus on being lean in the supply chain, trying to be as lean as possible with enough inventory, but not too much inventory. Also, you could say we trimmed all the fat. We have been moving into a quite anorexic type of supply chain, and we were relying quite a lot on the fact that deliveries are speedy. There is a fast delivery. There is a continuous availability of all these raw materials. There is abundant capacity in terms of production, labor, and so on, so on. And of course, what you now see happening because of this, because of the current crisis, and that's also what I think this recent survey in Germany is referring to, is that you see that many of these conditions which we thought would be there are not there anymore.
What have we learned, Professor, about supply chain problems? And have we learned enough to be able to solve them?
It's quite interesting because if you talk about learnings, if you look at supply chain, one of the basic, let's say, lessons in terms of supply chain is, of course, that you somehow try to do an end-to-end from source to sink, from the raw material up to the customer. You try to manage your supply chain in the most effective and efficient way. And of course, it's in this managing supply and matching supply to the demand side, we also see it's also about managing uncertainties in the supply chain. And we make always a difference between the things we know, the known stuff, but also the known unknown things. So there are many things which we do not know, but we actually know that they will be happening. So the forecasting sales, for example, for tomorrow is relatively easy, and we have been having a lot of instruments over the past years, over the past 20, 30, 40 years of managing the known unknowns. Now, if you talk about a situation like a pandemic, or if you talk about Brexit or Lehman Brothers or any other natural disasters, this is much more about what we call unknown unknowns. So we don't know about these kind of things, what the severity will be, the magnitude. We also don't know when they will be happening, how they will be happening. And the key question is, how can you build a supply chain that is sufficiently coping with these kind of situations? And that's not easy. And that's, of course, people then talk about what they call a resilient supply chain. Resilience in the supply chain, it is basically saying, how can you prepare yourself for rare disruptions that are happening in the supply chain, but rare meaning maybe once in a lifetime. And what do you do with that? And that's quite an interesting discussion, because Yeah.
Well, it's
Then
a
you get
discussion
into-
we're going to have to wait to hear in the future, because for the moment, Professor Tom Van Woensel, many thanks for joining us on The Agenda.
Thank you.
Still to come here on The Agenda, food for thought. We'll be hearing why supply chain shortages could change the way we eat forever. Murray, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to The Agenda. We've looked at supply issues from a European perspective, but of course the very centre of the global supply chain is China. So is China too suffering from similar problems? And how can China help the world get back on its feet? With me now in Beijing is Chu Chang, Assistant Director of the International Monetary Institute at Renmin University of China. Chu Chang, the whole world is suffering from supply chain problems. What exactly is the situation in China?
Inside of China, the situation is back to normal. We should say ever since the end of the last year, the situation is returning back to the normal situation. But also we see lots of problem happening in here. Actually, have done some investigations around the local enterprises. There is a listed company in Shenzhen. They've been telling me they have a bittersweet problem. The good part is they have more than $100 million worth of the orders now coming up in and still coming in continuously. But on the other hand, they have all the inventories piled up in their warehouse. What's happened is because they cannot ship the products outside of China because the shipment become extremely expensive and you can hardly book any empty ships. And also the whole order and system of the transportation over the ocean has right now in the very, very chaotic situation. So they see the order and they have all the productivities and all the capacities, but they cannot make the shipment done, and hence they cannot receive the rest of the payment. And this kind of situation are really, really normal right now in China. So even though China has controlled pretty well of its domestic COVID-19 situation, but still China has also been under the impact of the whole international chaotic due to the COVID-19.
Are all these issues, Chu Chang, down to COVID, or are there more, shall we say, fundamental issues that need addressing with regard to China's role in the global supply chain?
Well, I think the major and direct impact is due to the COVID-19, and everybody can understand that. Well, we do have some long-term structural problems in the whole global chain system, but that is, you see the good side of us. Also, there's a bad side of it. The good side is the human being after the Second World War actually spent this decade to build up a very delicate division of labor network and also the supply chain. We have the raw material in these countries, and we have the secondary production lines in that countries and the primary production line in those countries, and the whole very delicate. And this is not formed by the artificial well or by any human power. This is actually formed by very, very natural reasons. It's decided by the cost. The reason why we have such a delicate supply chain is because people will naturally choose which they can get the cheapest raw material. They have the most handy transportation network and location. So naturally grow up into that kind of delicate situation like we've been seeing and enjoying today. But COVID-19 made us to think about this for the first time, that is really fragile and delicate. We cannot even suffer a little bit of blow on it. Otherwise, you are gonna see the situation and suffering we're having here today.
How can China help solve the world's global supply chain problems?
Well, China really can help in this regard. China right now is the world's largest manufacturer, and everybody would understand and see that fact. And with this capacity, China is not just to rely on it and to try to hold this power to itself or to use it as a bargain. But China really want to share this capacity. You're seeing China right now, many Chinese enterprises, private and SOE, they're going global, like the Belt and Road countries. And we've been having lots of branch companies, branch factories in ASEAN countries, in Africa, in Europe also. And they've been duplicating the Chinese production power. So make the distribution and the shipment much easier with a shorter route, with a lower cost.
What preparations then could you make to deal with the possibility of new variants arriving? We've already seen one in Britain and Europe, the Omicron variant, and there will be others, no doubt.
The solution is that we try to make a more robust supply chain. Like we said, we can always have a plan B factory, plan B transportation route in the rest part of the world. And China can help with it. And secondly, we do need more vaccine for the COVID-19 or some other unknown disease coming to us in the future. The way we can do that is like China has been cooperating with Egypt. We built more COVAX or other vaccination factory in the world to help those countries, especially the developing countries, to have their own productivities to make this medicines. And I think this is the ultimate way that we can help each other. Because China, well, I'm not saying China is a saint or do these things for, or any kinds of holy reason. I mean, this is just a very reasonable decision. You see, if the other part of the world has been shutting down, the market has been suspending, where does China go to sell their products? I mean, this is the moment that whole human beings need to hand up together and help each other. Only by helping your neighbors, your friends, your partners, and you can help yourself. And I think more than ever, we should understand this.
Chu Chang, many thanks for joining us on The Agenda from Beijing.
Thank you.
The sight of empty supermarket shelves has become an increasingly common one in much of the world. Over the last few months, food delivery supply chains appear to have been particularly hard hit by the pandemic and the associated labour shortages. But just why is that? And what needs to be done to solve this particular issue and put all the food we want back on the shelves? Well, joining me now is Tom Bradshaw, Vice President of the UK's National Farmers Union. Tom, what impact did or is the pandemic having on food security?
Well, right back at the start of the pandemic, I mean, there was the panic buying incident, if we went back to the end of March 2020, and there was the very real prospect that the just-in-time food supply chain wouldn't cope. At that point in time, it was really a replumbing exercise because the out-of-home market had shut down, and we had to find a way to get that food, which was destined for, for food service and for restaurants, into the mainstream retail sector, which actually was relatively simple. The challenge that we're seeing at the moment is a more systemic problem. That you highlight the labour shortages, but that's right from a farm level, picking the fruit and vegetables, through to the HGV shortage, and then it's even a shortage in supermarkets and retailers as well. So there is now a systemic problem or challenge within our supply chain, which is creating this backlog and the empty shelves that we're seeing.
Earlier this year, we saw how the Suez Canal blockage affected stock levels and delays. I imagine a lot of food was spoilt because of those delays. I know they come in big freezers, most of them. Are we finally moved on from the ripple effects of that?
Well, I don't know if we are or not. I mean, the Suez Canal was just an example of what happens when there's a blockage anywhere. But actually, what we've seen through the pandemic is that we've had displacement of goods and products, and particularly containers. So whether they be refrigerated containers or the metal containers that are actually now in ports where they're not required. So there hasn't been the ability to get them back to the countries where things are produced. I mean, I'm particularly thinking of consumer goods here and getting them back over to China so that the products can be shipped over here. I mean, then when we think of food supply chains, it really is absolutely reliant on having the availability of those refrigerated containers in the countries where they're required. And I think that what it's really done to me is highlight the importance of having a level of self-sufficiency within your country so that you can feed your domestic population.
There have been a lot of scaremongering headlines, haven't there, Tom, in Europe and UK as well, about there won't be enough turkeys for Christmas, not enough vegetables for Christmas. Does this narrative make people rethink about what they really want? Or does it make the situation worse, perhaps by panic buying?
I hope it makes people engage with their food and actually think about what it is that they want and not take it for granted. Now, if you go back to the beginning of the COVID crisis, it was the first time for many decades that you've actually gone into a retailer and not been able to buy what it was that you went there to get, because we've always had ultimate choice. And so I hope that people are beginning to value the things that we've always thought and taken for granted, whether that be the workers that produce this food or whether it be the food on the shelf. We really need to think and value those things and the way that they're produced. And there is a turkey shortage, there's no doubt about it, because we've seen turkey producers have about 20% less turkeys this year than previous years. So that is a reduction in output, a reduction in the availability of turkey at Christmas. But I think that the food supply chain is very resilient. It's under huge pressure, but I will be surprised if we get to Christmas and there are empty shelves. I think that we managed it during the beginning of the pandemic, and farmers and food processors will do everything they can to keep those shelves full ahead of Christmas.
You mentioned earlier the just-in-time supply chain system. I wonder, is that sustainable for the long term?
I think we'll always be reliant on the just-in-time food supply chain. We've got 70 million people living on an island here, but I think what we do need to accept as customers is that we're going to have restricted choice. And it isn't normal, I don't believe, to be able to walk into a retailer and expect them to stock everything every day of the year. So whether that be strawberries at Christmas, we have to think about seasonal produce. And actually, we have to think about buying local and seasonal, because they're the things that start to impact climate change as well and reduce our environmental footprint if we're eating those things that are produced seasonally. And so we've got to start to enjoy the different seasons and the produce that's produced across the times of year, rather than expecting everything to be available every day of the year.
Tom Bradshaw, many thanks to you for joining us here on The Agenda.
No problem at all.
It is certainly not unusual for global supply chains to have occasional blips. It is one of the main disadvantages of globalization. But the pandemic has meant that almost every step of the global supply chain has gone wrong, and all at once. Most of the big suppliers thought that lockdowns would cut demand, but the reverse happened. People were at home, glued to their laptops and phones, and they were ordering online. The e-commerce boom fueled the pandemic demand, but the supplies weren't there. Then when lockdowns started to ease, demand continued to spike, and still the items weren't available, or at least not immediately. Add to that increased demand for imports when there aren't enough lorry drivers, along with late arriving container ships, and the supply lines broke down. The bottom line is that a global transportation system linking factories to containers to consumers wasn't designed to operate, well, for such long periods, working at peak capacity. And in case you didn't know, it's Christmas too. So there's been no let-up in the holiday season, and that means the global supply chain is under even greater pressure as it tries to cope with increased consumer demand. This was the year the system seemed to reach its breaking point. And although retailers are optimistic the worst may be over, we could well be into 2022 before the twisted chains are untangled. As Tom Van Woensel said, planning for the unknowns is an impossible, but also an essential task. Don't forget you can watch everything from past Agenda episodes and find additional exclusive content on our website, cgtn.com/Europe, or on our YouTube channel. And of course, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, at CGTN Europe. Coming up on a future agenda, as a new COVID variant threatens the world again, we'll have an exclusive interview with the World Health Organization's Regional Director for Europe, Dr. Hans Kluge. But for now, from me, Stephen Cole, and all the Agenda team here in London, it's goodbye.